Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Institute for Security, Science and Technology and Chris and Andrew Burton for inviting me here. Now, Chris said he was gratified at the number of people here. I'm absolutely terrified because I'm a historian and I don't deal in facts the way that scientists do. And it's much less, you can see immediately from the rather roxy, sexy kind of slides that you've been watching for the past 5 minutes. Now, this is serious and sober scholarship from a historian. So I warn you already that that's what I'm going to offer you. And my main focus tonight is the subject of science and the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, popularly known as MI6, and I'll refer to them just indistinguishably between them, but also how the acquisition of science, scientific and technical knowledge, was central to SIS's mission over its first 40 years. How that process depended on SIS itself possessing a modicum of scientific knowledge. And thirdly, how the work of intelligence also stimulated scientific and technical investigations and developments. But I'm also interested, I'm going to talk a bit about the sort of narrative, just the stories over the first 40 years of SIS's history. But I'm also interested in three other themes which I kind of see as running through my reflections. And I don't intend to discuss these in any great depth, but to my mind they resonate throughout any study of intelligence and science, and which potentially might have contemporary as well as historical application. But again, I say I'm a historian. I deal most confidently with the past. And regarding SIS, I can only speak with any authority, if that, about the service's first 40 years. And I have to say I'm speaking, the words that I say cannot be interpreted as representing the views of any government department. They're merely my own views. I'm an independent historian, hired as a kind of hired help by the service to write unofficial history. But the first theme I just want to highlight is the science of intelligence work and the extent to which intelligence gathering and analysis might be regarded as scientific. The Oxford English Dictionary defines scientific method as systematic observation, measurement and experiment, and the formulation, testing and modification of hypotheses. Now, much of this, while allowing for some flexibility on the meaning of experiment, applies not just to intelligence work, but the study of history as well. When I was an undergraduate, there was a frequent discussion of whether history was a science or not. Much of this was led by that greatly reduced tribe, the Marxist historians, now becoming extinct, perhaps. But they had, of course, a vested interest in scientific history. But the common sense procedure of systematically advancing and testing hypotheses by, for example, reducing variables as much as possible, seems to place historical inquiry, at least in parallel with inquiry in other less humane disciplines, if I might put it that way. Lord May has been much quoted recently as suggesting that science is organized skepticism and a powerful way of asking the right question, no more, no less. Questions are raised, possibilities noted, experiments designed, and so forth, in a way which should give no grounds for alarm among historians or indeed intelligence officers. The second theme is about the dissemination of specialized knowledge to a non-specialist audience. This is, I understand, a significant concern for scientists and underpins the impetus towards what my scientific colleagues tell me is PUS, the public understanding of science. And embedded in this is a conviction concerning the fundamental importance of science and the need for practitioners, or some interlocutors, to explain scientific findings and evidence to government and the public at large, and to emphasize, to establish, to celebrate, I suppose, the importance of science. Some parts of the humanities feel similarly. And while there are, I think, no chairs in the public understanding of the humanities, seems quite interesting, analogous to the chair in Oxford, the science of the public understanding of science, there are subsidiary efforts in the field, the Royal Historical Society and Gresham's College sponsors an annual Colin Matthew Memorial Lecture for the Public Understanding of History. And while history's efforts are certainly inspired by a desire, for example, to promote evidence-based public policy making, learning from history, about which I could wax very lengthily but won't, another occasion for that, I'm not sure that historians would necessarily ascribe quite so much authority to our facts as might at least some scientists. Historical facts are peculiarly slippery customers, and part of my job as a teacher of history is not only to encourage organized skepticism, but also to impart an understanding that historical phenomena, their causes, course, and consequences are complex affairs, not often, if ever, susceptible to simple or simplistic analysis. Yet, in the public arena, there is a kind of compulsion to exude more certainty than one might ideally wish. My default response to virtually any historical question, someone comes up and asks me something about history, I mean, apart from, that's not my period, I'm afraid, which is the first thing I would say. But it's usually some combination of, this is complex, it's not at all straightforward, there are many factors to bear in mind, and so on, which is not a response which will get me interviewed on the television more than once. And although scientists' facts seem more fixed and definite than those of the, the historian, there is a theme in the public understanding of science which stresses uncertainty and variability and variableness. Lord May, again, believes on broad outline what one wants is the science, with all its uncertainties, fully exposed to frame a debate and constrain a debate. The Royal Society's Bodmer report in 1985, which did so much to set the, I don't think this is a very nice image, the pus ball rolling, it says here. Not a very nice image, but the whole business of the public understanding of science said that everybody needs some understanding of science, its accomplishments, and its limitations. So, uncertainties and limitations. And this brings me to the intelligence sphere, where you have specialized inside knowledge and a kind of high priesthood to manage that knowledge and bring it to their political and military masters. They are supposed to know the facts. Indeed, they're supposed to know everything. That's what they're paid for. And it might not be much use if all they can come up with is, this is very complex, there are uncertainties, I have to tell you of the limitations of our knowledge. And perhaps what intelligence agencies need is, like the scientists, some campaign for the public understanding of intelligence, which might lead people to understand what intelligence, like history or science, cannot do as well as what it can. My third theme briefly turns on the problem of secrecy, which is central to the workings of intelligence organizations, not simply in the information they gather, the secret information they may gather and disseminate, but also in broader aspects of such things as their organization, finance, personnel, sources, and methods. But this sort of constraint cuts right across the academic's responsibility to share his or her scholarship as widely as possible. Publication of findings is fundamental to scholarly endeavor. And I am not paid out of public funds for my work to be some sort of private benefit. Indeed, in a sense, my scholarship, as anybody else's, does not exist until it is published. Yet, as an official historian, there are things which I have learned that I am prevented from making public. Not very many, but there are some things. And the same conditions will have applied to the scientists who have worked for security and intelligence agencies, Vincent Briscoe, after whom this lecture is named, and those who have worked for SIS. There will, I assume, have been a tension between their obligations as scholars and their obligations as, citizens or employees in the service of the state. I just want to bear those in mind, those rather serious points, with those preliminary points. Let me turn to the history of SIS. The first chief of SIS, the first chief of what became SIS was a sailor, Commander Mansfield Cumming. And his selection as the Admiralty's nominee for the new Secret Service Bureau in October 1909 was a classic and pioneering example of the informal way in which, for a long time, the Secret Intelligence Service, and I think the Secret Security Service as well, treated the important subject of recruitment. Kind of tap on the shoulder, dear boy, something would be interesting. Usually dear boy, not invariably. And although the 50-year-old Cumming had no apparent direct intelligence experience. In fact, he was exceptionally well equipped for the job through his engineering and scientific expertise. Now, I've slightly changed my mind. I emphasized the point in the book about how unqualified Cumming was, and I've thought about this, and particularly through thinking for this lecture. I slightly modified my views, and I think he was much better qualified than I originally thought. He had worked in the Navy from 1898 on boom defense, harbor defense in Southampton. And he was a practical man, much enthused by the latest mechanical devices. A keen pioneer motorist, here he is, unconventional, there you go. A keen pioneer motorist and a hair-raisingly fast driver. He joined the Royal Automobile Club in 1902, and 3 years later was a founder member of the Motor Yacht Club, an offshoot, which is also the Royal Motor Yacht Club from 1910. He was a founder member of the Royal Aero Club and acquired a pilot's license at the age of 54 in November 1913. There are hints that Cumming's interest in motor yachting and high-performance marine engines, which he shared with many naval officers, helped him put him in the frame for the job. The Admiralty in the early years of the century were intensely interested in the potential of new types of marine engines and wanted to be fully informed about the activities of the Motor Yacht Club and their international races. You can see the same thing happening in the 1920s and 30s with international air races. These are places to try out the latest high-performance machines. And of course, these are of intense interest to the various branches of the armed services. And Cumming played a part in this. In the spring of 1905, he had been sent on a tour to study the development of motor propulsion in fishing fleets in Sweden and Holland in order to ascertain the reliability of internal combustion engines running on paraffin. So it was that by the time he was selected for his job, he had gained some experience of information gathering abroad. There was more to it as well. He was appointed to head the foreign branch of the Secret Service Bureau, but there was also a home branch, which turns into MI5, and headed by Vernon Kell at the beginning, and their job was to protect British installations and British secrets from foreign agents. And some of the things that foreign agents were interested in were British defence installations, including harbour defences. They're clearly interested in that. And it made perfect sense to appoint an expert in harbour defences to the new Secret Service organisation. And from the beginning, technical intelligence was central to Cumming's new organisation, and he began gathering information on these from well-disposed fellow countrymen. In January 1910, just 3 months after the formation of the organisation, an unnamed director of a British armaments company who'd been on a business trip in Europe, he's called Mr. Queer in Cumming's diary. But he gave Cumming the specification which the foreign government had themselves got from Krupp's for a heavy gun, and reported that the Krupps were now using nickel-chrome steel, entirely oil-hardened and tempered for their larger guns. And that, from the very beginning, was the kind of information, or part of the kind of information, that Cumming's agency, tiny at this stage, was charged to collect. He also went on his own intelligence-gathering missions. In April 1910, he went to Liège in Belgium to meet an agent from Germany who was going to report on airships, and was supposed to have brought a new type of portable weapon. Now, Cumming equipped himself as best he can for this. He arranged for a photographer, he arranged for a weapons expert, and a marine colleague to come with him to meet J.R., who was this, again, unnamed agent. But when they got to Brussels, J.R. changed the arrangements. He said he wasn't going to meet them in Brussels, he was going to meet them up near the frontier, and on a much sort of tighter timescale from this. And it's evident that J.R. had more experience of intelligence work than Cumming, because it's a classic bit of tradecraft, is to change the arrangements at a late stage, for security reasons. And so it's only Cumming and the photographer got to see the weapon. The weapons expert was parted from them, and they quickly worked to make some notes about this. Cumming had only 10 minutes to look at this very quickly, and only a few minutes in which to handle the thing and make such measurements as I could and make a thumbnail sketch. I did my best. This is in Cumming's diary. I did my best, but was surprised afterwards to find how much I had managed to leave out. All he could ascertain was that the weapon had sights marked from 100 to 700 meters and from 800 to 1900, and that it fired 5 shots. It all seemed to be in vain. When he got back to London, both the weapons expert and the Director of Military Intelligence concluded the device was of no special interest, and Cumming even offered to pay the £25 he'd given to Agent JR for the information. Now, the moral of this story is that you need to know what you're looking for, and to know enough to know if you're being sold a pup. And the lesson seems to have worked after two Danes turned up in London at the end of 1910 and offered Cumming a wide selection of material, including maps of German naval bases, sketches of a torpedo mechanism, and several signal codes. They asked for £5,000, which the contemporary equivalent is £350,000, which in Cumming's opinion was not to be thought of. Even if we had accepted their plans as genuine, we would have offered them £200 for the lot. In the end, he paid them nothing other than £10 between them for their travelling expenses. They went away disappointed. But he did quiz them, and in fact obtained a great deal of information about underground tunnels in various harbours, in harbour defences, his special subject, of course, and the existence of landmines laid from a central firing station. So he did better in that case. And he also brought his devotion to the latest technology to bear on some of the intelligence challenges he had to face. He was an early promoter of wireless communications. He thought it offered a solution to the problem of getting messages through quickly. One of the other jobs he had to do is not simply to explore German potential and German capabilities, but also the possibility, as was thought, of the Germans launching a surprise attack either on Britain or indeed on France. And he wanted an early warning system, and he began in the spring of 1912 discussing with French intelligence colleagues the development of a mobile wireless station, very early stage at this stage, with a motor car and a range of 250 miles. The quest for the perfect secret ink was a constant preoccupation for Cumming's bureau, and naturally an area where scientists could make a contribution. And of course, this was part of Vincent Briscoe's expertise. One of the challenges, as for all espionage technology, is to find equipment and so on for which one might have a plausible excuse for possessing. Like an espionage organization itself, equipment has to be what you might call deniable. There has to be a plausible, benign excuse for carrying these things. If you're carrying a miniature camera, you're up to some no good, so it's actually not such a good thing to have a miniature camera. And concealing devices are a good example of this. If you're caught with a concealing device, you are caught red-handed, or some other part of your anatomy, of course, as we shall see. In a review of SIS officers after the Second World War, one officer reflected that ingenious concealing devices are a favourite subject with writers of spy stories. In practice, however, there's not a great deal to say on this subject. Once a person is suspected of carrying secret papers, it is almost certain that a rigorous search will discover them. I mean, a good security officer will know all the places to look at. And concealing devices were normally only designed to evade a routine examination, for which a quite simple device is adequate. Hollow hairbrushes, nail brushes, toothbrushes, pocket mirrors, backs of pocket mirrors, fountain pens, pencils, the soles of shoes, cakes of soap, toothpaste, and shaving cream. In fact, the most popular were creamy substances. Reports reduced to about a square centimetre could be wrapped in a condom and buried in the centre of the pot of cream concerned. Contrary to popular belief, said the review, suitable parts of the human body, such as the inside of the mouth, hollow teeth, the anus, and the vagina, were not used, or not often used. One instance, however, was a sleeping car attendant on the Trieste-Lausanne trains in the Second World War, who brought reports from a network in North Italy to Switzerland, wrapped in greaseproof cloth and concealed in his anus. The fastidious writer of the review remarked that the transference of reports from the agents to our representatives is just another example of the varied and not entirely pleasant nature of the duties of an SIS officer. So it's not all glamorous. But back to secret ink. In June 1915, we find Mansfield Cumming making inquiries for invisible inks at London University. I don't know which branch of it. It might have been this one. In October, he told Colonel Kirk of military intelligence that the best invisible ink is semen, which did not react to the main detection methods. Frank Stagg, one of Cumming's wartime colleagues, recalled that all were anxious to obtain secret ink, which came from a natural source of supply. He said he would never forget C's delight when the Deputy Chief Censor, a man called Worthington, came one day with the announcement that one of his staff had found out that semen would not react to iodine vapor, and told the old man that he'd had to remove the discoverer from the office immediately, as his colleagues were making life intolerable by accusations of masturbation. We thought, wrote Stagg, we had solved a great problem. But our man in Copenhagen evidently stocked it in a bottle, for his letters stank to high heaven, and we had to tell him that a fresh operation was necessary for each letter. That's French letters rather than Danish, I suppose. At this stage, SIS's first scientific advisor was appointed, Thomas Merton, a 28-year-old lecturer in spectroscopy at King's College London. He had been rejected for active service on health grounds, but was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and taken on by Cumming in June 1916. Apart from helping with the manufacture of lenses previously supplied from Germany, one of Merton's first discoveries was the method of secret writing used by German agents, who soaked the requisite chemicals in clothing. Once dried, they could be carried without arousing suspicion. One source says this was underwear, though in the biographical memoirs of Fellows of the Royal Society, Merton was elected in 1920, the only specific article of clothing mentioned is socks, so perhaps underwear is a bit too racy for the Royal Society. Underwear, of course, emerges as a bit of a theme in the history of SIS, although there is no entry for it in the index to the book. You'll have to search it out. But during the First World War, an attractive Belgian woman of good family, who had good cause to hate the Boche, was employed to seduce a German agent. She agreed that nothing, either of a personal or moral nature, was to be shirked in order to obtain a successful issue. She was sent to work against a German network in France. Given British Secret Service contact addresses in Paris, she was also supplied with several articles of underclothing impregnated with secret ink, partly for delivery to a certain address in France and partly for her own use. The mission was a great success, and the entire enemy organization was apparently destroyed. Thomas Merton also invented a secret writing method for Cumming. And this formula is in my book, and you can test it if you like. I haven't done so. I wait for scientists to report back on this. But it was in the biographical memoirs of the Royal Society, so it must be accurate, one feels. I'm very credulous in these matters. But this was not his only scientific contribution to the Secret Service. In one account of the wartime service, a note by Merton's name says, worked at secret inks, bombs, etc. And it's clear that Cumming warmly encouraged scientific and technical research. And it's clear from Merton's experience that this research was shared with MI5 for counterintelligence work, and again pioneered by Vincent Briscoe. And of course there were other, Cumming continued to work on wireless telegraphy. There was a coding section, so cryptography was important too for the service. And in head office, Cumming was always ready to try out new gadgets, from soundproof doors to a detectaphone, which is evidently some sort of listening device. The contribution of scientists to Secret Service methods was not the only concern. As revealed in a review of the service's wartime work, in which Boyle Somerville, the head of the naval section, observed that an important limitation on the ability of the Secret Service, there was an important limitation of the Secret Service by the lack of technical knowledge. That in order to acquire the best sort of technical experience, you needed to know something about this. And he felt that better equipped, better informed, knowledgeable naval officers should be seconded to the service. Though he did reflect at the fact that career naval officers were a bit reluctant to commit themselves to the apparently dubious activity of intelligence work, in the fear that it might damage their prospects. So there's a bit of a tension there too. Now, it's clear that Cumming continued to value the technical side. In the post-war budgets, now this isn't a huge organization in the interwar period, and it's grossly underfunded, but there's a £65,000 budget prepared in 1920-21, equivalent to about £2 million today, and in that was a modest enough allocation of £1,000, about £30,000, for technical matters. And some of this seems to have been earmarked for Merton's successor, a Dr. Dawson, taken on as chemist in 1919 at £500 per annum. So it's a part-time job, evidently, one feels. Cumming renewed his contract at a slightly reduced level in July 1921. Now, I'm not absolutely sure who Dawson is, though the most likely candidate is this man here, Harry Medforth Dawson, Professor of Physical Chemistry at Leeds University, and a specialist in the mechanism of chemical change in solution. So it kind of fits the sorts of things, certainly the secret ink side of things, one feels. And he was elected to the Royal Society in 1933. But for the most part in the interwar period, it seems that scientific assistance was provided on a consultancy basis. And of course, SIS could also call for assistance from the technical branches of the armed services. And it was a very small organization. In the 1920s, the great, powerful British Secret Service, with a worldwide remit, had a total complement, or a full-time complement of fewer than 200 people, 60 odd at home and about twice that number abroad. So it is absolutely tiny. The potential expertise problem, which Boyle-Somerville had identified, is perhaps illustrated by the unsatisfactory technical intelligence provided by British spies in the United States between the wars, tasked to report on American armaments developments. In 1930-31, for example, an employee in a firm of consulting engineers with American naval contacts was taken on as a paid conscious agent, knowing he's working for the British. Of course, there's a difference. I mean, there are people who knew they were working for the British, and of course there are paid unconscious agents who are working for the British but might think they're working for someone else. It's quite a clever trick if you can pull it off. But the Admiralty was unimpressed with his work. One report about solidifying gasoline was described as absolute nonsense, and another on steel density was obvious nonsense, and the informant appears to be unacquainted with subject. By 1932, he'd been dropped. Now, if his case officers had known a bit about this sort of thing, it might not have got as far as having to be embarrassingly delivered to the Admiralty, this apparently rubbish intelligence. Mansfield Cumming's successor as chief of SIS in 1923 was Sir Hugh Sinclair, a former director of naval intelligence and a technically competent officer. While he was the DNI, he had taken responsibility for the Government Code and Cipher School, Britain's unified signals intelligence agency, created out of the Army and Navy intelligence branches, which had operated during the First World War. And when Sinclair became chief of the SIS, he continued as non-operational director of the GC&CS, the Code and Cipher School. And this lasted for more than 20 years. And although the armed services kept some residual expertise in the field, SIS effectively acquired monopoly control over British secret signals intelligence, a fact which was to prove extremely important in the future. And they were very, very good at it between the wars. There were some ups and downs, but by and large, it was pretty good. But I'm not going to dwell on this. And there remains a potential disagreement between historians as to whether the signals intelligence agency's successes, both between the war and, of course, during the Second World War, was because of or despite the management of MI6. Nevertheless, some of the vital technical assistance in cracking the secrets of the German Enigma machine, which the Poles and French provided, came from human intelligence contacts developed by SIS. And the last time I was here at Imperial, there was an excellent presentations on cryptography, and I leave that for others to continue that work. And here, in any case, is Bletchley Park, a site of the Second World War triumphs, the code-breaking triumphs. And Sinclair purchased it in 1938 to be the war station for both SIS and GC&CS. And this was part of a series of developments in the late 1930s in SIS, which had a distinct scientific dimension. In the first half of 1938, Sinclair decided to set up an organization to plan, prepare, and when necessary, carry out sabotage and other clandestine operations, as opposed to the gathering of intelligence. This is special operations. This was Section 9, or D, allegedly for destruction, it was a Royal Engineer, a man called Lawrence Grand, was put in charge. He was a great enthusiast. He wasn't a great administrator, but he wrote his own wide-ranging brief in which he suggested sabotage targets in Germany, including the electrical supply system, telephone communications, railways, adulteration of food supplies. and agriculture by the introduction of pests to crops or diseases to animals. So this is, chemical and biological warfare. All these things requiring scientific expertise. There was also a category entitled moral sabotage by means of rumors, remarks causing dissatisfaction with the Nazi Party. Stuart Minges, who was to succeed, I'll have a slide of him in a minute, to succeed Sinclair as chief in 1939, at this stage as deputy, explained SIS's thinking on this matter to French opposite numbers in February 1939. He told them that in time of conflict, acts of terrorism would crystallize opposition to the Nazi regime and profoundly disrupt military and economic life in Germany. Now, government officials today would perhaps be less likely to own up to acts of terrorism, indeed promote acts of terrorism, than in the plainer speaking 1930s, but never mind. SIS's consideration of offensive sabotage operations clearly also provoked thinking about the defensive side. In August 1939, SIS prepared a paper on bacteriological warfare, which reflected further work in Grand's section. The possibilities of this form of warfare, it asserted, may have been underrated, especially the destruction of our flocks by anthrax or foot and mouth disease, also the contamination of our water and milk supplies. No, that's Stuart Minges. We move on. Here it is. Here's this memorandum from this. Now, this is classic thing you're not unable to read, but I've got a detail from it in a moment. Can, say, 100 Nazi agents supplied with bacteriological material and operating in the London Underground railways during the rush hour start a serious epidemic in London? Now, it's not so long since anthrax was being toyed about on the subway in the United States. And reflecting a more innocent age, it's the bottom one of this, B2. When even the Prime Minister had a conventional daily doorstep milk delivery, the memorandum asked, is the Prime Minister's or any other persons of national importance milk boiled before use? Milk bottles on doorsteps can be tampered with. And you have a kind of vision of Neville Chamberlain putting out the bottles, on a Thursday evening with one gold top and a, semi-skimmed for the wife kind of thing. And then some man in a Macintosh creeping around with a syringe of botulism or something. Innocent days indeed. In April 1938, Sinclair hired this jolly-looking man who had a volcanic temper, in fact, not reflected in this photograph, Richard Gambier Parry, from the telecommunications firm Philco, to create SIS's communication section, Section 8. And the most difficult task they had was the provision, and this was a great triumph. This man was a genius. He had the organizational, technical ability and the organizational ability that, in fact, Grand didn't have, the other section. But the most difficult task was the provision of wireless sets for agents. And Gambier Parry developed the suitcase radio, the classic transceiver of the Second World War, iconic sort of thing. It is the mobile phone of its day. It transformed. It was a technical leap of considerable importance, and certainly for intelligence operations. And that was only part of the enormous range of things that Gambier Parry's section did, not just providing communications for agents, but also secure communications for the intelligence produced. Because again, Bletchley Park's a good example for this. Gambier Parry was partly in charge of the organizations that gathered the radio signals for Bletchley Park cryptographers to decrypt, but he was exclusively in charge of the dissemination of that information, the secure dissemination of that information to bring it to where it's needed. And cracking Enigma codes or ciphers is of itself entirely a futile exercise unless the information which is gathered in that can be communicated, and you need technicians to provide that. And communications are at the heart of intelligence organizations, and certainly SAS in the wartime. Here's a rather posed photograph of a Norwegian agent with a suitcase radio and the old gun put there. And I don't think that the Germans were absolutely on his shoulder at this stage. it's up to the individual, and this reminds us that, of course, the individual men and women depended on this, to us rather primitive technology, to them very advanced. And these are very hazardous circumstances. A letter to head office in the spring of 1943 from a British radio operator working in the Lyon area described conditions on the ground. For the moment, I have to change places after each transmission. With only one set, this means that it has to be carried from place to place in order to maintain daily contacts. Owing to the absence of other means of transport, this has to be done mostly on foot. Last Sunday, I had to walk 9 miles carrying my radio set and the aerial. You can guess what a sport that is. Incidentally, the handle of the case is not strong enough. Mine broke twice. I can tell you, it is not very easy to carry without a handle. You know, these are kind of the everyday practicalities of this stuff. And of course, you had to have a suitcase radio that looked like a real suitcase without some hugely reinforced handle. So again, there's a technical expertise to provide stuff that is, deniably, or at least plausibly, has a plausible reason for carrying about the place. And his complaints do seem mild enough, considering the life and death circumstances in which he and others worked. One aspect of Section 8's expertise was the provision of bugging equipment for monitoring other people's communications. One very successful such operation was run in Chile, as a man called Henry Higman discovered when he was posted to Santiago as head of the MI6 station in July 1941. Here he found an elaborate telephone tapping operation actually located inside the British Embassy itself. And he was told that tapping the phone of a German-owned bank had produced most valuable economic intelligence. But Higman, and one of the problems about this is it's very dangerous to run, particularly a completely sort of obvious intelligence operation of this sort from the embassy itself, because then it has the potential for huge diplomatic embarrassment, and at the very least. And Higman tried to get the telephone tapping operation out of the embassy building. What had happened was, in the mid-1930s, the British manager of the Santiago Telephone Company had been renewing the system, and it said to the people in the embassy that perhaps if he put in a few extra lines, this might be useful, because they actually ran alongside the German legation's lines. And some of you are old enough to remember party lines were all these things, and effectively what the British legation had at that stage was a party line with some of the German ones they could just sort of tap into. So Higman, when he arrives, he says, well, this is very good, terrific, but we must get it out of the embassy. But discovered that in order to get it out of the embassy, you'd have to relay the telephone lines, and it would draw attention to the coincidence of the overlapping, as it were, of the German lines and the British lines. So he couldn't, but he had to make the best of it. And a special room was constructed in the basement. Here you are, a spy here at work, and equipped with the latest kit. And by December 1941, the calls of the German embassy propaganda office and 2 banks were regularly being monitored. And Higman thought this was a great success, and one of his best sources of intelligence, and sent these photographs home to prove it. Secret writing remained a tried and tested method of communication, but it too could be problematic. In 1942, the head of the Stockholm station had a job persuading a rather nervous Danish agent, whom he'll call 161, a timid man, to take back to Denmark some new tablets for making invisible ink. The tablets for dissolving in water. They were supplied in a Swedish box which had previously contained stomach pills. I assured 161 that in case of need, he could prove that these pills were for his own personal use and could demonstrate this by taking one. But he continued, I have no idea whether this will have any ill effect on this valuable agent, but I'm hoping for the best. Back at head office, a colleague noted, not toxic to any great degree. And at Cheshire, the head of the station, was reassured that the developer, although slightly toxic, would not harm him in smallish doses. While the whole packet might put him under for a bit, it was unlikely to bring about his demise. So that's a kind of reassuring message for the agent there. And of course, another expertise, which in both World Wars, was the expertise in forging documents. These are German bread tickets provided to agents coming from Switzerland into Germany, so they could get some food, some rationed food. This isn't actually a forged passport, because it's a British passport. This is a false passport, but I show it to you. It's a false passport that was used by the marvelously named Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale, a charming and successful intelligence officer, and arguably one of the possible models for James Bond, but we can discuss that another time. But he used this under the name of John Green when meeting representatives of Vichy French intelligence in Lisbon in September 1940. Now, SIS, of course, manufactured and used as real false passports. I mean, they forged passports of other countries. But I cannot show you an example, as this is a rightly sensitive area. While I've been able to refer, and this is this secrecy constraint, you see, one of them, I've been able to refer in principle to the use of false passports in my book. I am not able to tell you precisely which countries' documents were used. I can show you these are forged wartime French identity cards prepared for the rather glamorous Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who led a very successful network in southern France called Alliance. These are both forged identity cards, which obviously worked because she survived. And I can also show you an agent at work, perhaps taking a photograph of a forged document. This is Agent Ecclesiastic, a glamorous 22-year-old Central European woman living in Lisbon, who in June 1944, when she was taken on by SIS, was the mistress of an Abwehr, the head of the Abwehr in Lisbon, a man called Franz Koschnick. In August 1944, SIS arranged for her to get a job in an RAF air liaison office in Lisbon with the RAF personnel, which had been set up to provide technical assistance to the Portuguese government. And although there were in fact no technical air secrets in the office, it was assumed that the Germans could easily be led to believe that such material was to be found there. One of Ecclesiastic's case officers was a man called Klopp Ustinov, the father of Peter Ustinov, the actor, both of whom had a great eye for the ladies. And Klopp Ustinov's case reports of Ecclesiastic have a kind of keen appreciation of female charm, let's say. He clearly wanted to get her into bed, I think. And she said she was very intelligent and clearly enjoyed the game of mobilizing her ample female resources against normal male instincts. There we go. But up to the early spring of 1945, Ecclesiastic provided Koschnick with a stream of double-cross disinformation material prepared by MI5, including details about new airplanes and other developments. Someone crumpled up pieces of newspaper or note paper, convincingly scribbled notes of overheard phone conversations, letters containing aerotechnical gossip on authentic Air Ministry notepaper, one of which Koschnick had Ecclesiastic herself photograph before she returned it to the office, and here it is. And while he was doing it, perhaps for insurance, to show Ecclesiastic that he had evidence, you mustn't, rat on me because I have this evidence here, it took her, and he gave her copies of the photographs, which she promptly passed on to SIS, so they ended up in the archives. She looks, I think, as if she might be using a miniature camera. That strikes me as she could have used an ordinary camera. The issue of, why use a miniature camera unless absolutely necessary would apply there. One of Merton and Dawson's successors in the Second World War was this man, Reginald Victor R.V. Jones, an Oxford man who had worked with F.A. Lindemann, later Lord Charwell, at the Clarendon Laboratory in Oxford on infrared radiation. He was recruited by the Air Ministry in 1936, and in the summer of 1939, when the Air Ministry wanted to improve liaison with the intelligence services, he was attached to SIS and remained there for the duration, recording his service in his memoirs, his famous book, Most Secret War. And I'm not going to rehearse the contents of this deservedly famous and opinionated, that makes it a good read, book, but I will recommend it as an especially vivid account of the conjunction of science and British intelligence in wartime. One of the things he covers hours and quite a lot of detail, it was gathering intelligence about the German V weapons, the V1 flying bomb and the V2 rocket. And that's a really good example of all source intelligence coming together to provide vital information for the Allied war effort. A combination of human intelligence provided by SIS and other agencies, signals and communications intelligence, photographic reconnaissance with high-grade analysis, all crucial parts of the intelligence process, whereby raw data is gathered, collated, critically assessed, and tested until some reliable picture emerges. Clearly a kind of scientific method process to this. And one of the crucial, here's a document here, which was brought in 1943 to Bern. It arrives in the early spring of 1943. The SAS station in Bern received from a Luxembourger who'd been a forced worker in Peenemünde, where they're testing these, I quote, a very dirty, ragged sketch plan of some big contrivance being constructed by the Germans at an island called Peenemünde sometime in 1943. This filthy sketch plan seemed to make little sense. The head of station was away at the time, and his assistants decided to telegraph the most we could make out of this nonsense, this piece of paper. When he returned, he chided us for being such fools as to believe such nonsense, and said we would undoubtedly get a rocket from headquarters. Nevertheless, headquarters' reaction was quite the opposite. Bern was congratulated for most valuable information and ordered that anything further on the subject should always be telegraphed most immediate. And once you've got this, then you send over the air liaison, the photographic intelligence. You task Polish intelligence sources, because there's an important Polish network operating, to produce an immensely detailed plan of the facility, which was used for an Allied air raid in August 1943, which badly put back the whole program. So intelligence is absolutely crucial, and at the end of the Second World War, this was embedded in the post-war planning for MI6, who were beginning to say that scientific intelligence should be one of the main priorities of the service in the post-war years. There also is a research and development section set up in SIS. Partly this was to develop clandestine equipment of all sorts, and particularly for special operations matters, such as sabotage, explosives, fuses, drugs, and other chemical tasks. Communications remained important, and a government communications centre was established, which dealt with secure radio communications across the whole range. One of the advantages of having a bit like the government code and cipher school, the reason it's called this is to advertise its benign purpose, to teach people about making codes to keep British communications secret. The other side, the offensive side, is left unremarked on. And the same is true for secure communications, is that everyone will assent to the need for secure communications. Therefore, you can have your secure communications agency not on the secret vote, which helps. You can have a public vote in Parliament, and it can be discussed, at least in outline, in ways that you don't want a huge vote that's just for secret purposes, because it simply attracts attention. So there's a kind of political and psychological dimension to this. Also in the post-war period, an experienced Army Quartermaster Colonel with the designation Q was brought in to manage this side of things, so Q does, or indeed did, exist actually in SIS. But I want to finish with a few examples of actual scientific inquiry, as reported by the Training and Development Directorate from September 1947 onwards. A kind of PR exercise, public understanding of what we are doing. Here are the scientists within SIS trying to explain their work and celebrate their work, no doubt, to protect, among other things, to protect their budgets. These are, of course, important considerations. But the kinds of experiments undertaken, and therefore the kinds of activities that they may suggest, was indicated by five main lines currently under investigation. First was a device which will increase the security of operators on burglarious enterprises. Infrared equipment having been found to be too heavy, a torch which cast a deep red light was being worked on. So they're obviously burgling people. Second was a knockout ampule or tablet which will behave in a reasonably predictable manner. Now that does suggest And bearing in mind the variability of human beings. And that's one, of course, one of these classic red herrings about, truth serums and all the rest, is that truth serums, don't work, movies, you sort of feed someone an injection or something and suddenly they start yapping. No, my pharmacological friends tell me you need to weigh people, you need to do something about their metabolism, you need to know what the pressure is and the temperature and all sorts of things. And there are very few substances that are reliable truth serums. I had a friend who used to give lectures to a course I was running on drugs and intelligence, and he would say that only when administered in the correct circumstances and the right amounts is a drug useful for providing truthful intelligence. And here it is, and he had a slide of a bottle of Bushmills Black Label whiskey. Third was a method of opening combination safes. So there you are, back to the burgling these. Fourth was a gun silencer, which does not become less silent with use. And there's a kind of backstory there one wants to know about. The final problem, though, was the destruction of paper. And paper, and it's really a story of good news about SIS scientific endeavor. Now, the destruction of paper is not at all an easy task, but it's one which the painful experience of the Second World War suggested was worth addressing, bearing in mind the problems stations had experienced destroying documents ahead of the German Blitzkrieg in 1940 in The Hague, in Oslo. In fact, there's a wonderful story in Oslo. The Oslo embassy, or the legation as it was then, is at the top of a hill, and the SIS office was down at the bottom of the hill. And they were bringing these up. They had a bonfire at the top of the hill in the garden of the embassy, and they were bringing these baskets of documents up the hill as the Germans are coming up the fjord, and German bombers are going overhead, at which point the Oslo Fire Brigade arrived, that imperturbable sort of Nordic, well, we have to fix this, and they tried to put out the fire, and they were saying, no, bring petrol, not water, petrol, don't you understand? But this was a real problem, and of course the research team focused in on the destruction of all those files you have kept till the last moment, which are inevitably the most secret and the most vital ones. I mean, this is the kind of paradox, is you don't keep the useless stuff to the end, you keep the real, the holy grail, the crown jewels, as it were. And you destruction of those files you kept to the last moment, and the last moment comes a little sooner than you expected. There is no time now to shovel the stuff in the fire, because a determined man could hit you with one hand and pull the stuff out with the other. So various techniques were tested, including accelerated burning and the chemical destruction of paper. Acid, for example, would destroy paper, but at normal temperature it might take several days. A mechanism, therefore, had to be devised to raise the temperature, both to char the paper, as charred paper is easily soluble in sulfuric acid, and to speed up the process as a whole. But no foolproof system had been developed yet, while the aim was to ensure the rapid destruction of a filing cabinet full of files, and here's the actual report. Oh no, here it is. We hope the paper will discard in the way things are going. It would have to be, we're on a flight of stairs, it would have to be a short cut, man, like that, and broken wind. And this is a public, a public understanding of science. You could do it with a sense of humor. People like it, you see. Good marketing here. But by the end of the 1940s, the problem of destroying paper had been satisfactorily solved by a twin strategy of reducing the problem and improving the method. The original aim of destroying a filing cabinet full of files proved to be so difficult that the technicians asked for a review of the absolute minimum of documents that could be held, and finally got an agreement that code books and 3 top-secret files would suffice. This had a total weight of 9 pounds of paper. I understand, consulting my more modern colleagues, is about 4 kilos. 9 pounds of paper when the hard covers of the code books were removed. With this new target, progress was rapid, and under laboratory conditions, by interleaving the documents with oxygen-carrying material, they succeeded in destroying the lot in less than 2 minutes. The next stage was to mock up a safe to see if the paper could still be destroyed under rigid security conditions. Some 40 spectators assembled for an outdoor trial, which went spectacularly well, as one account testified. For perhaps 15 seconds after initiation, there was no appreciable change, other than a small trickle of smoke from the vent holes at the base of the safe. Then, as combustion got underway, the volume of smoke increased, soon to be replaced by long, roaring tongues of flame. Some spectators said afterwards that they felt the safe was on the point of explosion, and they noted that so great was the force of gas issuing from the jets that the safe was lifted some inches off the ground. The writer of the report was unable to confirm this, as by that time he had retired to a place of safety behind a building. But a usable safe producing a less violent combustion process was developed, in which hardly any flame emerged from the vent holes, although large quantities of smoke made the immediate area uninhabitable. But the research and development section were able to celebrate a job well done and the production of a satisfactory incendiary safe in which 9 pounds of paper could be completely destroyed in just under 2 minutes. History, it seems, and perhaps science too, is progress. Thank you.